Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the official season 2 premiere and Halloween special of the Nick Files. Just before we get started, I just want to make a quick shout. Well, send a quick message out there. I do apologize for the effects that the issues I had last week. What was originally supposed to be the premiere of last week's show, due to technical issues, but fortunately, I was able to get that solved. And this time, we shouldn't have another issue like that again because I was able to figure out the entire issue. So, obviously, as you guys can see, I'm still on my desktop as my laptop that I usually do my show on. Is still under repair. I hopefully should be getting it back within the next couple of days. I'm hoping to get it in time, for just in time for Halloween. So, because that, I'm going to have to still resign. I'm going to have to still use the desktop instead for the show. Just a quick shout out before we get started. What's up, Justin? Good to see you. And of course, obviously, hopefully all of you guys are having a wonderful Halloween season, because for today, I know I started doing this last week, but I have a special slideshow for as the Halloween special. Hey, what's up? Good to see you. Yeah, miss you too. It's been quite a while. Good to see you, Vivian. Thanks for tuning in. Excuse me. So, anyways, we got a very special presentation for today. It's something that's going to be certainly one of the most unusual presentations I'm giving. I do want to give a quick warning before we get started. I should have actually put it on the slideshow. Good to see you, Jeremy. Thank you very much. Today we're going to be focusing on a location that's called the Grand Guignol Theater. Now, like I said, I know I did start going with this. I started presenting this last week, but due to a lot of, again, the issues, I just decided it would probably be best if I just started all over, which I didn't really get too far. And also, I found some additional information that I actually just recently added just a few hours before I got started, which I thought was really useful to add. Let's see here. What's my thoughts on this being like how they are in Star Wars? Telekinetic. I don't know, to be honest with you. I really don't know. I mean, I am a big Star Wars fan, but I don't know really how to think about telekinetic. What's up, Peggy? Good to see you. Thank you very much, Vivian. Always appreciate it. Ernie, good to see you. Okay, so let me get the slideshow ready. Give me 1 second here. Again, this time I got this whole thing fixed up. So, and from this point on, for those who are tuning in, as a constant reminder, unfortunately, I'm not going to really be able to see comments. So I'm going to have to rely on using my phone for it. So I'm going to get that set up quickly. Okay, I just saw the last comments. Okay, so I'm in the Halloween jumper. Thanks, Vivian. And Justin, yeah, I guess I could say pretty much go ahead. I'm just getting the comments ready to go. And just want to make sure you guys can see this. All right, awesome. Okay, so obviously, as I've already mentioned, this is the official Halloween special. I'm going to say right now that this is probably going to be most likely a two-parter slideshow. It's no big surprise that it is, but that was kind of my expectancy from the beginning. So we're going to get, but before we get started with this actual theater, we're going to go a little bit over of how, because I think a lot of people have always wanted to know, because we see in a lot of our horror films, especially from the 70s, 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, where we've had a lot of that specific like slasher and splatter genre. People have often wondered where exactly did a lot of that actually come from. So what we're going to do first is we're going to focus on, for the first couple of slides, the earliest films that displayed a lot of the slasher and splatter elements before we go right into the theater, because it really does kind of add a little bit more to the history. It's not just on the theater itself. So, to begin, the first appearance of gore, the realistic mutilation of the human body in cinema, can be traced to D.W. Griffith's Intolerance in 1916, which features numerous Guignol-esque touches, including 2 on-screen decapitations and a scene in which a spear is slowly driven through a soldier's naked abdomen as blood wells from the wound. Several of Griffith's subsequent films and those of his contemporary Cecil B. DeMille featured similarly realistic carnage. Crime writer Mary Roberts Reinhardt influenced horror literature with her novel The Circular Staircase, written in 1908, which then was adapted into the silent film The Bat, which came out in 1926, about guests in a remote mansion menaced by a killer in a grotesque mask. Its success led to a series of old dark house films, including The Cat and Canary, released in 1927, based on John Willard's 1922 stage play, and Universal Pictures' The Old Dark House, released in 1932, based on the novel by J.B. Priestley. I think that's how you say her last name. In both of these films, the town dwellers are pitted against strange country folk, a recurring theme in later horror films, along with the madman on the loose plotline. These films employed several influences upon the slasher genre, such as lengthy point of view shots and a sins of the father catalyst to propel the plot's mayhem. Early examples include a maniac seeking revenge in The Terror, originally released in 1928, based on the play by Edgar Wallace, which sadly, some people have said this is probably, even though these other films kind of characterize, some of the early splatter and slasher films, The Terror is probably a very unique film alongside The Bat that really kind of played probably the earliest roles of how slasher movies came to be made. Now, I'm going to say this, in case any of you guys are interested in checking these films out, I'd highly recommend it. However, the only one I would not recommend is The Terror. The reason why for that is it's not because I'm not discouraging people. Unfortunately, as of right now, even almost 95 years later since its original release in 2022, no copies of the movie are known to exist. It's basically been lost to time, but I know there's a lot of film scholars, film historians, and of course, obviously fans that are still, hoping to see if there's ever going to be a copy that will turn up, because a lot of these movies that do disappear eventually do come back. Someone eventually finds a copy over time. And I believe, too, The Terror may have also been, even though 1928 was a year when sound was coming into films, there were a good majority of movies were still made without sound. The Terror, if I'm correct, may have been the first horror film with sound. So then a year later, in 1929, okay, that didn't show up, but Un Chien Andalou, I think that's how you say it, in English, an Andalusian Dog, a short French silent film which showed a woman's eye being cut with a razor, was considered another early example of on-screen gore. In the United States, public outcry over films like this eventually led to the passage of the Hays Code in 1930. The Hays Code is one of the entertainment industry's earliest set of guidelines restricting sexuality and violence deemed unacceptable. You have to remember, too, this was at a time before ratings were ever invented. There was no rated G, no rated PG, certainly no rated PG-13, no R rating, no NC-17 rating. So because they didn't have the ratings back then, they had to certainly follow these set of guidelines. And this Hays Code that was put into action with these movies, they were, for the most part, this went on for well over almost 40 years. From what I was told and from what I researched, is that the Hays Code stayed in effect, I think, all the way up till about either 1968 or 1970. So well over a good 40 years. Just want to give a quick, just want to check on comments here. Okay, so it's still pretty much the same. George Archainbaud's, I think that's how you say his last name, 13 Woman, released in 1932, tells the story of a sorority whose former members are set against one another by a vengeful peer who crosses out their yearbook photos, a device used in subsequent films in the 80s. This, too, is probably what you may consider, once again, the earliest example of a slasher movie. Even though the killer herself, I'll say, I'm sorry to be spoiling, but the killer herself, which also additionally may have been the very first, if you want to call it, early slasher film where it actually has a woman committing these murders. You know, and especially at a time like this in the early 30s, you having a female doing all these killings was probably something that no one ever expected in those days. But the difference about the 13th Woman is that even though she is technically responsible, the way how she commits these murders is that she does not carry the actual axe herself. But she does, I've seen the film, but it's been quite a while. She does something, I think it's like a spell of some sort, where it causes the victims to either commit suicide or have the other students kill each other. Even though she's not exactly committing these acts, obviously she's still responsible, and that once again pretty much sets the origins of how slasher movies would be made, but to a much different degree. B-movie mogul Val Lewton produced The Leopard Man in 1943, about a murderer framing his crimes against women on an escaped show leopard. Basil Rathbone's The Scarlet Claw, released a year later in 1944, sees Sherlock Holmes investigate murders committed with a five-pronged garden weeder that the killer would raise in the air and bring down on the victim repeatedly, an editing technique that became familiar in the genre. Robert Siodmak's The Spiral Staircase. It says 1946, but I think it was actually released in 1945. Based on Ethel White's novel, Some Must Watch, stars Ethel Barrymore as a sympathetic woman trying to survive black-gloved killers. The Spiral Staircase also features an early use of jump scares. British writer Agatha Christie's particularly influential 1939 novel, 10 Little Indians, adapted in 1945 And Then There Were None, centers on a group of people with secret pasts who are killed one by one on an isolated island. Each of the murders mirrors a verse from a nursery rhyme, merging the themes of childhood innocence and vengeful murder. House of Wax, The Bad Seed, Screaming Mimi, Jack the Ripper, and Cover Girl Killer, all released from the early to late 1950s, all incorporated Christie's literary themes. Post-World War II Germany adapted British writer Edgar Walls's crime novels into a subgenre of their own called Krimi films. The Krimi films were released in the late 1950s through the early 1970s and featured villains in bold costumes accompanied by jazz scores from composers such as Martin Botcher and Peter Thomas' Fellowship of the Frog, about a murderer terrorizing London, and successful in America, leading to similar adaptations like The Green Archer in 1960 and Dead Eyes of London, both released in 1961. The Rialto Studio produced 32 Krimi films between 1959 and 1970. Now, in the late 1950s and early 1960s, the public was reintroduced to splatter themes and motifs by groundbreaking films such as Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho in 1960 and the output of Hammer Film Productions, an artistic outgrowth of the English Grand Guignol style, such as The Curse of Frankenstein in 1957 and Horror of Dracula in 1958. Additionally, one of the first movies to include the elements of splatter in color was in the 1958 horror film The Fly, which, of course, I think a lot of us are which has also been said to be considered one of the scariest movies ever to have been made at that time. Not just for Vincent Price, but, starring in it, but also, if you haven't seen it, I don't want to spoil it. Then a year later in 1959, Horrors of the Black Museum, a British horror film that also was originally supposed to have Vincent Price, but then was later replaced with Michael Gough, was said to be the real first movie considered to be a splatter film. But perhaps the most explicitly violent film of this era was Nobuo Nakagara's Jigoku, released in 1960, which included numerous scenes of flaying and dismemberment in its depiction of the Buddhist underworld Naraka. That same year, Mario Bava released Black Sunday. Violence isn't rampant in this movie, but there are some gruesome scenes. And you think about 1960 as violent, and that's a black and white movie. So even under the black and white camera, it's a pretty graphic film. And Jigoku, released the same year, that movie was filmed in color. So I haven't seen the film yet, but I cannot imagine how messed up it probably is. It's even hard to believe that even a film like this would, be released from that era. I have one woman I couldn't contemplate 13. Not sure what that's supposed to mean. Now, here's one, obviously, which I just briefly mentioned. This is one I think we're all too familiar with. Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, originally released in 1960, used visuals that have been deemed unacceptable by movie studios, including scenes of violence, sexuality, and even the shot of a toilet flushing. The film featured an iconic score by Bernard Herrmann that has been frequently imitated in slasher and horror films. That same year, Michael Powell released Peeping Tom, showing the killer's perspective as he murders women to photograph their dying expressions. Psycho was nominated for 4 Academy Awards, including Best Supporting Actress for Janet Leigh and Anthony Perkins, garnering universal acclaim for his role as Norman Bates. This notice drew bankable movie stars to horror films. Hammer Studios, a London-based company, followed Psycho's success with Taste of Fear in 1961, Maniac in 1963, Paranoiac also released in 1963, Nightmare in 1964, Fanatic, The Nanny, and Hysteria all released in 1965. Hammer's rival Amicus had Robert Bloch, author of the 1959 Psycho novel, write the script for Psychopath, which was later released in 1968. Francis Ford Coppola's debut Dementia 13, released in 1963, takes place in an Irish castle where relatives gather to commemorate a family death but are murdered one by one. Now, that was just like a lot of these films I talked to you about does demonstrate a little bit of the splatter genre, but it definitely had that was more kind of the slasher elements. Now we're really getting to the good. I mean, now we're getting to the real start when things really started heating up as we get into the early 60s. Yeah, it's a creepy film, Jeremy. I've only seen a few parts of it, but the way how Mario Bava he does a great job. He certainly was a master of Italian horror. So now, splatter came into its own as a distinct subgenre of horror in the early 1960s with the films of Herschel Gordon Lewis in the United States, which I should tell you guys really quickly. I am fortunately honored to have met Herschel Gordon Lewis at a Fangoria convention. And Jeremy, since I know you're watching, this was the same convention that me and Don got to see meet George A. Romero. Herschel Gordon Lewis was also there. I was actually able to chat with him. We got a great picture. I got his autograph. So it was certainly an honor to meet basically the pioneers of the genre. It's just sad to know that, of course, since then, both Herschel Gordon Lewis and George A. Romero, have passed away since then, respectfully. God rest their souls. But, even just reading this myself, it brings back memories. Oh, Ernie said, Psycho is one of the all-time great horror flicks. If only the director's cut could have been released, it would have been even better. The studio's forced Hitchcock to edit out or reshoot stuff. You're absolutely right, Ernie. You're absolutely right, because that stopped 15 minutes ago. No, you're absolutely right, though, Ernie, because this was still during the time when the Hays Code was still in force. So, and again, something that was never done in movies like this before. I could, as much as I hate to say it, I could sure understand why they were telling him to reshoot it. But now we're going 3 years later. So talking about Herschel Gordon Lewis now, eager to maintain a profitable niche, Lewis turned to something that mainstream cinema still rarely featured: scenes of visceral, explicit gore. In 1963, he directed Blood Feast, widely considered the first splatter film. In the 15 years following its release, Blood Feast took in an estimated $7 million. It was made for an estimated $24,500. Blood Feast was followed by two more gore films by Herschel Gordon Lewis. 2000 Maniacs in 1964 and Color Me Blood Red in 1965. Lewis would continue making several splatter films throughout the 1960s and early 1970s, including A Taste of Blood and The Gruesome Twosome, both released in 1967. That's not supposed to say it, but it's actually The Wizard of Gore, released in 1970, and The Gore Girls in 1972. This grotesque style later translated to other movies made throughout the decade. William Castle's Homicidal, released in 1961, obviously 2 years before Blood Feast, features gore in its murder scenes, something both Psycho and Peeping Tom had edited out. They actually, what's kind of interesting about the movie Homicidal, if any of you guys are familiar with director William Castle, he was known very well for his gimmicks that he would make in the theaters throughout the 1950s and 60s. And like, for example, like House on Haunted Hill, during the skeleton sequence, he would have like an animatronic skeleton flying over the audience. In the movie The Tingler, they had what were those things called? Like, they had like these electronic devices on the bottom of their chairs, which would send a jolt, kind of giving that tingling sensation. Mr. Sardonicus, you had the punishment pole where they gave you glow in the dark cards, so you could decide whether Mr. Sardonicus should live or be punished. In the movie Homicidal, this little trick that William Castle had was what they considered a fright break, which was a timer that would play during the film, during the last few minutes of the movie, and it would give the viewer, I think it was like 45 seconds, to decide whether they were going to remain for the rest of this movie or they were going to leave. The fright break was your only option, whether you wanted to stay or not. So it was quite an interesting gimmick that he used. What's up, Brad? Good to see you. Psycho changed a lot of things in the horror genre. Very true. Now, Richard Hillard's Violent Night, also released in 1963, showed a black-gloved killer's point of view as they pulled down a branch to watch a victim, and also featured a skinny dipping scene. Again, something that was never really shown in such movies like this before, especially in the mainstream. Crown International's Terrified, released that same year, features a masked killer. Blood and Black Lace, released in 1964, was one of the first Gigli films, which it's actually Jello, which is Italian for the color yellow, in fact. Concerns the brutal murders of a Roman fashion house's models committed by a mass killer in a desperate attempt to obtain a scandal revealing diary. I've seen Blood and Black Lace, and it really does once again show elements like you would see in a lot of the masked slasher films of the late 70s and 80s. So they do a great job with it, and they got quite a good cast even for an Italian film. I think Cameron Mitchell's in it, so that was quite a surprise when I saw this years ago. And it's also, as they say in the trailer, it's all these films except for Homicidal and Terrified. I'm not sure about Violent Midnight, but despite all these movies coming out in the 60s, as you guys could probably see in the poster, they are all these other ones, they are in bleeding color. Now, in 1968, The Ghastly Ones, directed by Andy Milligan, was released and is once again considered one of the earliest films to have slasher elements. In this case, it deals with a hooded figure, not a mask, but one of the first that deals with a hooded character, which, as usual, we don't find out until the end of the movie who it is. Now, Eddie Romero, a director from the Philippines, also created a splatter trilogy from 1968 to 1971, which the films are Brides of Blood, The Mad Doctor of Blood Island, and Beast of Blood, which became known as the Blood Island series, which started with an earlier film, Terror is a Man, from 1959, which, from what I've heard, is not as obviously released at that era, is not as gory or as graphic as these Blood Island films would be. Rosemary's Baby, I thought I'd throw this in, also included relatively gory sequences. Now, Witchfinder General, I don't know if this is a film you guys are familiar with, it seems like 1968 was the year where a lot of the I guess you can kind of say the debut of constant gory films were released. So Witchfinder General, which was also released that year and surprisingly starring Vincent Price. Although the film is moderate by modern standards, the film is almost relentlessly violent and sadistic, with graphic extended displays of torture and blood and extended focus on the pain of the victims. It is perhaps considered the most violent film that Vincent Price starred in. Also in 1968, obviously this is no surprise, you cannot think of 1968 in horror without one very important film. Also in which came the release of Night of the Living Dead, directed by George A. Romero, which since has not only become a classic, but this was the film alongside Dawn of the Dead, released 10 years later, to coin the term splatter film. And one of my all-time favorite movies. In fact, I need to watch that later tonight because it's always a requirement. I always need to watch Night of the Living Dead before Halloween's over because just a classic. Oh, okay. Looks like I forgot to. I guess I should have shrunk down the text a little bit. Spain's The House That Screamed, released in 1969, features violent murders and preempted later campus slashers. Oh, actually, no, that's it. No, we're good. So now that we're past through the 60s, the 1970s really began to see an increase in the genre. In 1970, I Drink Your Blood, which was a ripoff of Night of the Living Dead from 2 years earlier, was released and displayed a huge amount of gore. But it was with two movies in particular that not only were controversial films of the time, but served as another important chapter in the slasher and splatter genre. Twitch. Oh, wait, they didn't show up. Okay, that's weird. Twitch of the Death Nerve, also directed by Mario Bava and released in 1971. And The Last House on the Left, directed by Wes Craven and produced by Sean S. Cunningham, released in 1972. Italy's Giallo films, as I mentioned earlier, thrillers, are crime procedurals or murder mysteries, interlaced with eroticism and psychological horror. Giallo films feature unidentified killers murdering in grand fashions. Unlike most American slasher films, the protagonists of Gigli are frequently, but not always, jet-setting adults sporting the most stylish Milan fashions. These protagonists are often outsiders, reluctantly brought into the mystery through extenuating circumstances, like witnessing a murder or being suspected of the crimes themselves. Much like Krimi films, Gigli plots tended to be outlandish and improbable, occasionally employing supernatural elements. Mario Bava's a okay, I don't know why the pictures were not shown, but here we go. Mario Bava's A Bay of Blood, which was also an additional name that was added for the original name of Twitch of the Death Nerve, is a whodunit depicting creative death sequences on a lakeside setting and greatly inspired Friday the 13th in 1980 and its 1981 sequel. If you guys decide that you want to see Twitch of the Death Nerve, if you guys are familiar with the films, obviously with the Friday the 13th movies, you'll understand what I mean when you check this out. And as you can see, when this movie came out in 71, as you can see on the poster, it was considered the first motion picture to require a face-to-face warning. Right before you walked into the theater, even the trailer says, "We must warn you face-to-face." And as violent as it is, I mean, they say there's like 13 sequences of intense shock. They say, and when the warning was that if you are weak stomach, if you have a weak stomach from that type of violence, do not attempt to leave your seat. If so, close your eyes and wait until you're able to regain your composure. So, as it says here in the poster, diabolical, fiendish, savage. You may not walk away from this one. Despite successes, Giallo films gradually fell out of fashion by the mid-1970s as diminishing returns forced budget cuts. Last House on the Left, despite being a controversial film, which more focused on the rape and revenge genre, it also, too, later incorporated, a mistype right there, to what the slasher genre would be several years later. Word of note, Sean S. Cunningham and Wes Craven would later go on to direct Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street, respectively. With these early examples, they have since again created what is considered the modern-day slasher and splatter film. So now you guys kind of get an idea of where a lot of these movies. Yeah, I know a lot of these movies. Many have never heard of, but I know plenty of. I know there's people who are familiar with some of these movies, but there's also other ones out there that I get it, that are not very familiar with. But that's why I thought I'd spread the word about them. So now you guys kind of got a little bit of an introduction of how blood, gore, and slasher films kind of started. Well, before any of these movies were ever made, we're going to go now way further back, long before, even during the time when movies of any kind were ever made. And that is, and now we're going to take, I guess you can kind of say, a little trip to Paris, France, and check out the history of the Grand Guignol Theater. This is an actual picture of it. And see, currently watching the Puppet Master series, very underrated series. I've seen most of those movies. Yeah, they're very underrated, but I still enjoy them. They're still fun to watch. Okay, hang on, I just want to check. Okay. So now we focus on the history of the theater. Now this is where the action really begins. There is a legend about Paris's gruesome Théâtre du Grand Guignol, which testifies to the squeamish, macabre nature of its horror plays and bloody special effects. The Grand Guignol was a theatrical institution that put on a variety of short, provocative plays, two vicious, brutal horror pageants involving bloody maiming and murder, and then two extremely silly comic shows. The two formats worked in tandem, winding the audience up and then ringing them down. But the Grand Guignol is only remembered from it for its horror components, disguising bloody and nearly unrelenting violence. Le Théâtre du Grand Guignol, or the Theater of the Big Puppet, was founded in 1894 and bought and opened in 1897 by the Théâtre Libre associate, French playwright and chien de commissaire Oscar Meitner, who planned it as a space for naturalist performance in Pigalle. I don't know that I'm saying that right. A disreputable district near Montmartre. I think that's alongside the Moulin Rouge. Just so you guys know, I actually did practice some of these words with the pronunciation, but unfortunately, there was a lot to memorize. With 290 seats, with 290, I don't know where that came from. With 293 seats, and the stage was 7 by 7 meters. The venue was the smallest in Paris, France. The theater owed its name to Guignol, which means literally the big puppet show. Took its name from the popular tradition French Lyonnaise puppet character, whose original incarnation was as an outspoken social commentator, a spokesperson for the Canets or silk workers of Lyon, joining political commentary with the style of Punch and Judy. Over a span of 65 years, the Grand Guignol produced thousands of one-act plays, infamous for their violent and erotic works of horror. When Théâtre du Grand Guignol did open, it did not deviate from many theatrical precedents established by its ancestor. The appeal of watching people inflict violence upon each other dates back thousands of years to ancient Rome, though fictionalized accounts became marketable with late 19th century horror plays produced at the Grand Guignol. Maurice Tourneur's The Lunatics in 1912 used visceral violence to attract the Guignol's audience. Oscar Meitner was the Grand Guignol's founder and original director. Under his direction, the theater produced plays about a class of people who were not considered appropriate subjects in other venues: prostitutes, criminals, street urchins, and others at the lower end of Paris's social echelon. André Antoine was the founder of the Théâtre Libre and a collaborator of Meitner. His theater gave Meitner a basic model to use for the Grand Guignol Theater. Despite its enthusiasm for horror, the Theater du Grand Guignol did not start as a venue for that kind of entertainment. This does not mean that the plays Meitner, that's how it's supposed to say, Meitner, had chosen for production at his new theater were not considered shocking or sensationalistic. Before the Grand Guignol, he produced and wrote plays in this vein for the Théâtre Libre, experimenting with creative decisions intended to both astonish audience and scathingly criticize the system. His play La Casserole, Stool Pigeon, performed at the Théâtre Libre in 1889, was a violent story of betrayal and murder among prostitutes and pimps at a cheap dance hall. The audience was enormous. Hold on 1 second, guys. Excuse me. I knew that. I could feel that coming. The audience was enormous. Intrigued by showman André Antoine's warning that viewers with weak constitutions should leave before La Casserole began. The show was a commercial success. Meitner had found success turning popular naturalism into shocking spectacle a decade before the Théâtre du Grand Guignol opened its doors. opening the night. Now, fast forwarding to when it actually opened. Opening the night of April 13th, 1897, the theater played 8 short works. During its first couple of years, it began as a theater of realism, mainly showing short one-act slice of life plays about ordinary Parisians and expressing a more naturalistic theme in each of its plays. Early Guignol puppet shows were also frequently censored by Napoleon III's police force. Naturalism had, at the time of the Theatre de Grand Guignol's establishment, ceased to be a peripheral intellectual and artistic movement, becoming instead a full-fledged fad. Writes Gerald of this transformation. Many of its motives and techniques started to filter down into the popular arts and general consciousness. By the early 1890s, themes of low life achieved wide popularity in the graphic arts of poster and lithograph, as well as in the fusion of music and poetry and song. When Metenier operated the Theatre de Grand Guignol, he produced new works in the sensationally naturalist vein, as well as replaying popular classics from the Theatre Libre. But the show that really got audiences' tongues wagging was an adaptation of Maupassant's, that's a tough word, short story. One of the Grand Guignol's first plays was Metenier Mademoiselle, oh my God, based on the novel. I'm just going to have to skip it. Again, there was a lot of words I really had to try to memorize, but unfortunately I wasn't able to get to all of them. A story of daily life in a brothel set during the Franco-Prussian War in Le Brun, where a French prostitute kills a German officer and joins her sister as a prostitute to ensure the financial well-being of her parents, which was temporarily shut down by police censors, presented the first prostitute on stage. His subsequent play, Louis, united a prostitute and a criminal in the enclosed space of a hotel room. In addition, a former police secretary before his career as a writer and theater impresario, Metenier was more interested in emphatically emphasizing what he had witnessed on the job, the plight of the working classes and the real struggles of Parisian lowlife. He kept detailed accounts of all the horrible things he would witness throughout the streets of Paris. He represented this gritty suffering as vividly as possible on stage, often to the denunciation of the critics. This led himself to being a frequent target of censorship for having the audacity to depict a milieu which had never before appeared on stage. The Theatre Libre was a private theater and therefore free from censorship. But according to scholars Daniel Gerald, Metenier's play La Famille was forbidden from public performance elsewhere. A follower of naturalism, he believed his own experiences could be used to depict the perfect illusion of reality that naturalism called for. Thus, all of the notes he kept, combined with his knack for observing daily Parisian life, eventually served as the basis for some of his earliest works. Metenier was Guignol grown up, or grandi. I gotta move this quickly because it's getting in the way. The Theatre de Grand Guignol was an immediate success. Without realizing it, Metenier had laid the first stone of the edifice of the Grand Guignol repertoire, which was to last for over half a century. Little by little, and almost accidentally, a new genre was born. After serving 2 years as director for the theater, for reasons that are still unknown, Metenier passed on the reins and was succeeded as director by Max Maury, who was unknown in artistic circles, but had hands-on experience in the theater, and whose leadership soon led it away from the shadow of the Theatre Libre towards a new genre entirely, horror. He served as director from 1898 to 1914. Under Maury, although the plots of various plays still demonstrated the exploitation of innocent working class individuals, the Theatre de Grand Guignol grew distant Theatre Libre, drawing inspiration in terms of performance style from melodrama. Spotting this bloodlust, Maury quickly developed a unique brand for the Grand Guignol and shifted the direction of the theater and sought to exploit a darker side while still incorporating naturalism as a guiding principle. It became the home of grotesquely convincing horror stories, often based on real-life examples of sickening violence, and it turned the Theatre de Grand Guignol into the house of horror it would become famous for, and judged by the success of a performance by the number of patrons who passed out from shock. Despite all his directorial success, Maury is perhaps notable for his discovery of André Delorde, who would become the most important and productive principal playwright and novelist for the theater from 1901 to 1926, at a time when insanity was just beginning to be scientifically studied and individual cases cataloged. The Grand Guignol repertoire explored countless manias and special tastes. He wrote at least 150 plays for the Grand Guignol, such as the Old Woman, The Ultimate Torture, A Crime in the Madhouse, and many more, in which they split influences in writing style between naturalism and melodrama. Hey, Gary, good to see you. Thanks for tuning in. Due to his need to exploit terror and insanity, Delorde became known as La Prince de la Terror, the Prince of Terror. I'm just going to go back for a quick second. I got to admit, he probably would have to be the earliest example, like how horror directors like really went with their movies. I mean, hats off to these guys that really, put this all together. Something that was at that time was never seen before. So that is, I mean, even just reading it, that is just amazing to me. Now, wanting to incorporate the study of psychology into his plays, collaborated and acquired the help of experimental psychologist Alfred Binet, the man behind the modern IQ test. Together, they created and expanded the realm of possibility around plays about insanity, one of the theater's favorite and frequently recurring themes. His biggest desire was to awaken the monster that reside in each of his plays' viewers. And this is an actual photograph behind the scenes of some of the effects that they used at that time. I mean, I don't know if we're going to be able to get through all of it. Obviously, like I said, we're going to be splitting this into two parts. So understandably, I don't know if we're going to be able to get into more of the effects and photographs, but hopefully soon we will be able to get into it shortly if I do have enough time. But just want to kind of add this as like a precursor, if you will. With clever staging techniques for realistically suggesting gouged eyeballs, decapitated heads, hangings, face melting, hacked corpses, dismemberment and disembowelment, brain drilling, spurting blood by the bucket load, and plots drawn from newspaper reports of real-life crime and depravity, the Grand Guignol was where queasy realism met gaudy melodrama and was one of the most memorable and popular at its time. And all of this proved much more terrifying and popular than the traditional horror narratives of ghosts or monsters. So the theater looks relatively like any other theater, but imagine just crossing into the threshold into that theater, and especially during the late 19th, early 20th century, I could probably guarantee it was a whole new world for you once you walked in and took your seat. Under his guidance, the Grand Guignol established a unique style of theater that would become synonymous with its name and would lead to its classification as the theater of horror. Like Meitner, okay, there we go, I'm sorry. Delord was often a target of censorship, particularly in England, where scheduled touring productions of two of his plays were canceled by the Lord Chamberlain censors. The theater of the time, which delighted in vaudeville and Borgias settings, could not abide the sight of blood or corpses on stage. Camille Quasi, or oh man, I heard that earlier, but I can't remember how it was said. He served as director from 1914 to 1930. He contributed his expertise in a score of special effects in lighting, sound, and scenery to the theater's distinctive style. Under his direction, staging overtook text. Unfortunately, I was unable to find a photograph of Camille, but, at least I was able to find enough information about him. And get this, once he even bought a fully equipped operating room. As a pretext for a new play. That is just like, man, trying to do something like that today. Imagine the price to buy a fully equipped operating room. I mean, you're talking millions of dollars. This is actually already, I got to be honest with you, one of my favorite moments of the slideshow already. I'm going to get to who she is in just a second. In 1917, he hired the actress Paula Maxa, who soon became known as the Sarah Bernhardt of the Impasse Chapel, bringing all of these stories to life. Paula Maxa was one of the Grand Guignol's best-known lead performers and sometimes considered the great scream queen. So long before we had any of these scream queens that we're familiar with. Who am I thinking? Like people like Jamie Lee Curtis, Janet Leigh, the classics of Fay Wray, the classics Scream Queen 3, as I call it. Oh my God, I almost lost their names for a second. Linnea Quigley, Michelle. Oh my God, I already forgot her last name. Okay, I can't remember. You know who I'm talking about. Long before any of these Scream Queens, we ever had any of these Scream Queens. In my opinion, Paula Maxa was definitely what I would consider the original Scream Queen. Her popularity quickly arose as a result of her ability to connect with each of the roles she played, along with her ability to evoke severe emotions from the audience. From 1917 to the 1930s, she performed most frequently as a victim and was known as the Princess of Terror and the most assassinated woman in the world. According to Schneider, not an inch of her body was spared. During her career at the Grand Guignol, Max's characters were murdered more than 10,000 times in at least 60 different ways and raped at least 3,000 times. She also turned cries for help into cliches. Mel Gordon notes that she cried help 983 times, murderer 1,263 times, and rape 1,804 times. That is just wow. And what I'm about to now reveal to you guys is exactly how her character did die. Like how her character did die. It's unbelievable how she played these roles. So during her career, she was subjected to a range of tortures unique in theatrical history. She was shot with a rifle and with a revolver, scalped, strangled, disemboweled, raped, guillotined, hanged, quartered, burned, cut apart with surgical tools and lancets, cut into 83 pieces by an invisible Spanish dagger, stung by a scorpion, poisoned with arsenic, devoured by a puma, strangled by a pearl necklace and whipped. She was also put to sleep by a bouquet of flowers, of roses, kissed by a leper, and subjected to a very unusual metamorphosis, which was described by one theater critic 200 nights in a row. She simply decomposed on stage in front of an audience, which wouldn't have exchanged its seats for all of the gold in the Americas. The operation lasted a good 2 minutes, during which the young woman transformed little by little into an abominable corpse. That's quite a career, if you ask me. Now, believe it or not, before they opened this up as the Grand Guignol Theater, it actually used to be a former chapel. The theater's previous light was evident in the boxes with iron railings, which looked like confessionals, and in the angels over the orchestra. Although the architecture created frustrating obstacles, the design that was initially a predicament ultimately became beneficial to the marketing of the theater. And you can clearly see inside how small it pretty much is, despite the crowd. You can see the stairway, you can see the opening venue, the lobby area, and you can see just a little bit beyond there is a small bar. The opaque furniture, neo-Gothic wood paneling structures placed sporadically on the walls, and 2 7-foot-high carved stone angels hung above the orchestra that had been part of the chapel remained, looking down on audiences in apparent judgment, while the smell of incense reportedly still hung in the air of the building, exuded a feeling of eeriness from the moment of entrance. Oh yeah, this is just a couple primary photographs of the audience, either before or after any of the shows. Something tells me these were probably taken before a show was to begin, so you can see a lot of people are pretty much enjoying themselves, but I'm sure they didn't know what they were going to be expecting, despite the eerie feeling in the theater. The interior of the theater provided us, interestingly enough, a small claustrophobic atmosphere that made the audience a part of the show as well. They sat so close to the stage that it was almost impossible to escape the gruesome violence occurring before their eyes. In this way, the theater, just like the settings of the plays, served as a fertile ground for self-awareness with the monster that lies within each of us, resulting in only heightened emotional and sensational elements. Many members of the audience would get sick or pass out during performances. If the Grand Guignol was a popular theater in both meanings of the word, it was frequented by neighborhood locals as well as the higher bro audience of the comedy Francais. Not sure if I'm saying that right. It was not a public affair. People as well as more Borgias audiences came to this theater. Borgias audiences came to this theater across town for an experience, not only to see a show, but also for the promise of illicit, vicious thrills. The audience at Le Théâtre du Grand Guignol endured the terror of the shows. Endured the terror of the shows because they wanted to be fit. Now, yeah, they did endure the terror of the shows, but not everybody was terrified or sick or pass out. You could pretty much say these shows also gave another relatively unusual feeling and reaction. Many attempt because they said they endured the terror of the shows because they wanted to be filled with strong feelings of something. Many attended the shows to get a feeling of arousal. Going to the Grand Guignol was less a social act than a private one, and certain audience members preferred not to be seen. Now, this photo right here is an example. At the back of the theater and underneath the balcony were a series of private boxes with grids, originally built for nuns to watch church services that were available for theater goers to rent and allowed them to see out and watch the show during performances, but which prevented anyone from seeing in. A feature that many carousing couples took full advantage of because they would get so aroused by the action happening on stage. Not to get too graphic here, so I'm not going to say too much, but this is all I put into it. And some witnesses report, interesting, adding to that, some witnesses reported that the iron grill boxes in the back of the theater encouraged a certain extremism, especially during Monday matinees, when women often prepared themselves for adultery by throwing themselves, half dead with terror, into their neighbor's arms. Flirtation, Grand Guignol style. Now, this is actually funny, in my opinion. It has been said that audience members would get so boisterous in the boxes that actors would sometimes break character and yell something such as, "Keep it down in there," or "Have you finished yet?" Can you imagine you go into, something like that happens and then all of a sudden they break character and they're calling you out? That's got to be embarrassing. Oh, boy. And also, this is as far as I'm going to go. Whether they were more turned on by the sex farces or the torture is a matter of speculation, but it seems the Grand Guignol's patrons were certainly alive to the erotically charged juxtaposition of sex and violence. The cleaning staff would often find the seats stained. Okay, that's as far as I'm going to go. So let's move on. Although, as strangely enough, while some people definitely were supposedly aroused by some of the performances that went on stage, conversely, there were also other audience members who could not physically handle the brutality of the actions taking place on stage. Frequently, the special effects would be too realistic, and often an audience member would scream, faint, panic, or vomit during performances. Maury used the goriness to his advantage and measured the success of a play by the number of people who fainted from shock during its performance, according to a 1957 article in the New York Times. The average was 2 faintings each evening. To attract publicity, he began hiring house doctors to be at performances as a marketing ploy. For audience members of a delicate disposition, help was on hand. Part of the cunning myth-making of the theater was to put about the rumor that audiences fainted at every show, and so they always had their own doctor there to revive them. This ability to discover the extent of one's own inner darkness and the creation of an intimacy between the actors and the audience members were the reasons behind the theater's massive success. In the 19th century, as in the 21st, rumors of fainting were definitely good for the box office. During one performance, when a man watching the inhuman, ghastly horror play did faint, the in-house doctor was sent for. However, no doctor could be found. When the unconscious man came to, the theater employees apologized for their inability to locate their resident physician. The man explained wearily, "I am the doctor." Oh, that is just nuts. Like, wow. Like, just thinking about, like, you bring in these in-house doctors to help out with the, any audience members that faint, and you have one person that faints that you think is one of the audience members, only to discover it was the doctor himself. Crazy. I guess apparently that just goes to show that even for doctors who've experienced probably some of the most worst things that people have ever, doctors have witnessed, not even the strongest hearted doctors could handle a lot of what was going on stage. Oh, this guy, Max Morey, decided to move the theater from the slice of life to the slice of death. Laughed Richard J. Hand, professor of media practice at the University of East Anglia, who held a workshop for the Miskatonic Institute of Horror Studies on the Grand Guignol. It became a horror theater, but not a supernatural theater. They were interested in serial killers, escaped lunatics, revenge attacks, which no doubt drew people in. They'd read about it in the newspaper. They see it enacted on stage. In spite of all the exceptional okay, that's wait a minute. What's going? Hang on, wait. Oh, okay. I don't know why that's showing up early, but I'll just put it up anyway. In spite of all the exceptional writing, directing, and acting that occurred, Paul Ratino served as the real magic of the Grand Guignol. Without his precise and lifelike special effects, a performance could have easily turned into a comedic spectacle, ruining the theater's whole atmosphere. Ratino would become one of the most influential players in his field and develop methods of special effects and stage trickery now utilized throughout Hollywood. Ratino, who was also a stage technician, pioneered grisly, lo-fi special effects. He was famous for his invention of stage blood that apparently congealed under the lights, said Hand. I think that's who that's supposed to be. Again, it was a while since I made this, so I'm going to have to go back and find out who this was someone, I believe, who knew a lot of the history on the Grand Guignol Theater. So he developed terrific illusions, often based on magic tricks, the kind of thing Penn and Teller would do in a magic show, but building that into a horror show. So the eyeballs come flying out, or heads get chopped off, or acid melts a face. Acid attacks were in the news then. It has now proved a source of horrible inspiration. The actors of the Grand Guignol would use an early form of latex to suggest a gooey melting face. And in one famous short play, The Torture Garden, someone was skinned alive. They'd get a long strip of elastoplast, but the sticky side was painted red. When that was pulled off, you get that ripping sound, says Hand. Oh, wait. Okay, I know. Okay, so that's Richard J. Hand. Okay, now I remember. That's the guy below. Okay. So that's pretty cheaply made, a cheap effect. What's up, Kelly? Good to see you. Thanks for tuning in. Appreciate it. So yeah, they say when they pulled it off, that's when you get that ripping sound, says Hand. A simple effect, but apparently when it was acted well, it was extraordinary. People couldn't believe what they'd seen. Now, as I mentioned briefly earlier, for anyone that went to the Grand Guignol Theater and wanted to see its plays that it had, in a typical Grand Guignol performance, patrons would see 5 or 6 short plays, all in a style that attempted to be brutally true to the theater's naturalistic ideas. As I mentioned, the most popular and best known were the horror plays, which featured a distinctly bleak worldview and gory special effects, particularly in their climaxes. The horrors depicted at Grand Guignol were generally not supernatural. Rather, these plays often explored altered states like insanity, hypnosis, or panic. To heighten the effect, and if things got too grim, and to allow the audience some release from the tensions inspired by fear and insanity, the short horror plays were often alternated drama with comedies, particularly one-act sex farces, a lineup referred to as hot and cold showers. So that's probably, I believe, this is actually one of the performance. This is a photo of one of the actual performances at the theater. I think this was during one of the comedy shows. Thus, after experiencing the reason why they call it the hot and cold showers, thus, after experiencing the horrible, the audience was able to recompose itself with the likes of Ernestine set in rage. Ernestine is furious, or Adelie is fat, or hey, cocoat. I don't know if that's how you're saying it right. It's a structure for a good night out. That kind of patterning adds hand. Now, this is probably I think is supposed to be one of the horror shows. So you guys get an idea here. I assume this is basically one of the comedy shows, and just down below is one of the horror shows. Obviously, not showing any of the graphic effects yet, but it kind of does give you guys the idea. So, examples of Granking Y'all horror shows included, such as these posters and the stories behind them. La Laboratoire des Hallucinations, La Laboratory of Hallucinations by Andre Delord, perhaps the most famous Greg Guignol play. When a doctor learns that his wife is romantically involved with one of his patients, he enacts revenge and has his wife's lover in his operating room. He performs a sadistic, graphic brain surgery, rendering the adulterer a hallucinating semi-zombie. Now insane, the lover/patient fights back by ramming and hammering a chisel into the doctor's brain. Un crime dans un maison de fosse. I'm not really good with French, so in English, that's A Crime in a Madhouse. Once again, by Andre Delord. In the cell of an insane asylum, 3 lunatics, the Normandy woman, and 2 hags, hunchback and one eye, surround the innocent and fearful Louise during her last night at the institution. They gag Louise, whom they believe has been imprisoned for a cuckoo bird behind her eyes. One eye gouges out Louise's eyes with a knitting needle. Suddenly, terrified of One Eye's violent character, Hunchback presses her face against a red-hot stoveplate and watches One Eye's face sizzle away. El Horrible Passion, English, The Horrible Passion, both by Andre Delord and Henry Bausch. A nanny strangles the children in her care. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find a poster for that one. Le Baiser dans la Nuit, in English, The Kiss of Blood. This one by Maurice Level. A young woman visits the man whose face she horribly disfigured with acid, and he obtains his revenge. El Homme de la Nuit, The Man of the Night, by Andre Delord and Leo Marches. A necrophiliac who strangely resembled Sergeant Bertrand, a man sentenced in 1849 for violating tombs and mutilating corpses. Le Système. Oh, that one I was. Oh, yeah. It's okay. Le Système du Dr. Gordon et Plume. The System of Dr. Tar and Professor Feather, by Andre Delord. Interestingly, based on Edgar Allan Poe's short story, one of the few basically non-French stories. A journalist who, accompanied by his wife, travels to an old castle complete with moat, which has been turned into an asylum, in the hopes of writing about a new approach to curing patients, which is said to be practiced there. Arriving during a storm, they quickly discover that the inmates have taken over, and that the cure to insanity is gouging out an eye and slitting the throat. And finally, La Dernière Torture, The Ultimate Torture, by Andre Delord and Eugene Morel. A vigorous and painfully realistic little sketch of the last stand made by the French consul and his half-dozen men at the legation, which they have held gallantly for a month against the Boxers during their rebellion. They are at the end of their food and almost of their courage, as, while waiting in vain for help in the carnage, an incendiary fires around them. They go nearly mad with the frenzy of starving despair. The last torture is that of the consul when, to prevent his daughter falling alive into the hands of the Chinese, he employs her lover to kill her at the critical moment of the final assault announced by the cannonade. The lover refuses, so the father shoots the girl himself, only to find, as the corpse drops from his arms, that the firing is that of the rescuing troops who had just arrived in time to be too late. Looks like we got a few more. Gardiens de Frere, The Lighthouse Keepers, by Paul Autier and Paul Klockman. A son is bitten by a rabid dog before leaving with his father for a month in a remote lighthouse. Okay, so this one, it looks like there's no posters, but I was able to find the plots for them at least. La Veuve, Chop Chop, or The Guillotine, by Eugene Heros or Leon Ebrick. A museum's collection are enriched with the guillotine. The wife of one of the employees trains her lover to admire the new acquisition to get new fancy sensations. She asks him to place her head in the telescope of the machine. The young woman, Palmyra, then tastes a strange pleasure in kissing her lover, thus threatened with Morin. Sous la lumière rouge, In the Dark Room, by Maurice Level and Etienne Ray. A young man's mistress has just died. The Médecin des Morts, after a very cursory examination of the corpse, endorses the verdict of the local doctor that she died a natural death and orders the burial for the next morning. The young man, after an affecting conversation with a friend about his dead love, takes a photograph of her. When he develops it, he finds that the eyes, which had been closed, are open in the photograph. This is after the burial, and he naturally concludes that she has been buried alive. The next act takes place in the cemetery. The young man has obtained an order for exhumation. The coffin is brought in, but the corpse, when disclosed, is not seen by the audience. The face and hands are found covered with blood, and it is obvious that the young man's suspicions were correct. It ends oddly with the young man's consenting not to look for himself, and without any further attack on the Médecin des Morts. Oh, I guess there are some posters. Le Jardin des Supplices, The Torture Garden, by Pierre Chain and André Delord. A French politician's aide is sent on a pseudo-scientific expedition to China when his presence at home would be compromising. It then moves on to an account of a visit to a Cantonese prison by a narrator, accompanied by the sadist and hysteric Clara, who delights in witnessing flayings, crucifixions, and numerous tortures, all done in beautifully laid out and groomed gardens, and explained the beauty of torture to her companion. Finally, she attains her hysterical orgasm and passes out in exhaustion, only to begin again a few days later. I think there's, how many do we have left? Okay. Oh, wow. We got quite a couple more. Okay. El Euthanasie au le devoir de tuer. Euthanasia. By Renee Burton. 2-1 advocates the practice and the other condemns it, but the latter protects the former at the play's conclusion. At the climax of the play, the pro-euthanasia doctor takes the decision to prepare a lethal injection for his terminal patient in response to his suffering. He does not tell the patient what he is doing, but the patient realizes and consents, and has previously begged for death. Okay, so there's 3 more after this. Vers l'au-delà, Towards the Beyond, by André Delord. A mad doctor obtains permission to stand near the condemned man to observe the guillotine's grin and check if he dies immediately or if he's still in pain after the action of the cleaver. The Obsession, by André Delord and Alfred Binet. Jean is cursed with the obsession to kill his young son, Pierre. A Parisian psychologist explains that he is the victim of a progressive and an curable hereditary disease. Within a short period of time, Gene will be totally insane and unable to curb his murderous impulse. The psychologist advises that Gene commit himself to a mental asylum immediately. Gene, however, refuses to do so and returns home. He confesses to his wife that he, not his daughter, accidentally hit Pierre the other day. She thinks little of it and sends him into Pierre's room to apologize and bid the boy good night. In the room, Gene strangles his son. And finally, Rapid 13 by Gene Sartain, an embittered switchman of the railroad company, decides to wreck one of the newest trains, the Rapid 13, when it passes a station by not pulling the proper level. In the control room with his daughter, the switchman is at the last minute that his granddaughter is on the oncoming Rapid 13. He suffers a paralyzing heart attack and cannot grip the necessary switch. Responding to his gestures and nods, the railman's daughter throws a switch, but it is the wrong one. As the two hold each other in desperation, the Rapid 13 hurls into still another train, undoubtedly killing the switchman's granddaughter. Okay, so what I'm actually about to present, this because again, I only got 5 minutes left. What I'm now going to present from this point on are actual photographs of the performances. So this is the Grand Guignol plays. I just want to give a quick word of warning for anyone who's watching that these photos will be pretty graphic. They're not actual mutilations. No one's actually being horribly tortured, murdered, killed. But these are still pretty graphic pictures. But at the same time, they are amazing because you would never think twice again during the late 19th, early 20th centuries that they would have such effects like this. So either way, even though everything what you are about to see is nothing but just staged image, photos from the shows, viewer discretion is advised. All right, so you guys are ready? So these are the earliest photos I was able to find of a stage performance. I wasn't able to find exactly what year, but this was taken in the early 1900s. And as you can see, I don't know what show that is, but it looks like someone here has a gunshot wound to the side of the head. That's just only the start. Things get a lot more graphic from this point on. There were a few other photographs that I did try seeing on a website that I tried copying, but unfortunately I wasn't able to get them. So I got the majority of them, fortunately. So now we go to 1921 with such photos. Oh, wait a minute. Okay, I didn't realize that was uncensored, so we're gonna have to go ahead and fast forward to that. Sorry about that. I thought she was wearing something. I didn't see that. That's my apologies. Now we're gonna fast forward to 1925, which is again not necessarily one of the graphic plays, but again another demonstration of the Grand Guignol's performances. Now to 1935. Now we go even further to 1937. Now this is where a lot more of the gory pictures arrive in. And once again, as a reminder, these are all stage performances. That's pretty cool what they had back then. That is some good makeup effects with that zombie-like costume. That's amazing. Now go the following year to 1938. These are behind the scene photos now. Well, it's a combination. Here's like one behind the stage, and now here they are on stage. Oh, here's one of the eye gougings that they performed. All right, I better make this. I only got 2 minutes left before I have to get off here, unfortunately, guys. So we're going to have to end it here. Now, these are probably the most notorious photos of performances of the Grand Guignol. This is actually one of the shows that I talked about, dealing with the mental asylum one with the two hags. This was probably as best as I can go to kind of put this all in chronological order. This photo is probably the most famous of them all. That's incredible. I can even already imagine like what the sounds would be like, you know, if you're actually there. It had to have been pretty horrifying. Wow. Oh yeah, this is when he one of the hags burns one of the others on that red hot stove. Incredible. Incredible effects. Oh, more from 1947. Wow. I mean, this I could see where, like I said, a lot of these films got the inspiration from for making their movies like this. I mean, just wow. Give you guys just a few seconds because I got to get off here right afterwards. So after the pictures, I got to go. Oh, yeah, even more from 1947. Oh, they're burning someone alive. Okay, that's it's quite the performance. Give you guys just a few seconds. Like, okay, all right, I got to really hurry this up. Oh my god, still more from 1937. It's where I think they're using a dagger of some sort to like stab a young girl. That is just unbelievable. Jeez. Looks like 1947 was probably the most photographed year at the Grand Guignol. Looks like one of those insane asylum or doctor related shows. This is probably the one where it involves the zombie, you know, eventually driving uh, uh, a nail into the doctor's head. Yeah. I kind of now looking at it does make sense. I think I know which skit this is. Just imagine like right now how the audience must have felt when they were watching this. That's just it had to be horrifying but exciting at the same time. Jeez. Uh okay. Hopefully this is it because we will I gotta finish. I really gotta get off here because I know there's a show waiting for me. It's pretty cool stuff though. So all right, we're gonna have to make this the last official slide. Oh, now this is cool with self mutilation. Very gothic looking as well. I mean, this really does revolve around gothic literature in a way. All right. Oh, this must be one of those other shows where it dealt with someone who was deformed. I know I read one of the skits they had. That must be this show. Give you guys just a few seconds. Those are quite the effect. Oh, okay. Okay, we're about to approach the we're about to get to the end of all the pictures. So now I got some pictures here from 1948. And once again, as a reminder, these are all stage pictures because I don't want Facebook or any of these platforms think that I'm showing something that's actual torture. It's all staged. Okay, and finally, I think this is the last one. This is from 1950. Oh, wait, one more. Hang on. From 1951. Oh, jeez. 1952. Oh, please. I hope this is seriously it. I gotta get off here. So oh my God. 1955. Wow. Those pictures actually look older. It doesn't look like they were taken in the 50s. Okay. All right. That's officially all right, guys. So unfortunately, we are going to have to stop here. So because again, I know there's a show that's waiting for me right now. So I do apologize for still being on. But I just want to say really quick. Oh, it's actually, you know what? No, I actually made a good timing. Oh, wait, no, I started a few minutes later. That's why it's now officially an hour and a half. So yeah, it's quite a performance. Unfortunately, obviously, as you guys could pretty much understand, we're going to have to stop right here because unfortunately, again, I'm out of time. But I just want to say really quickly before I get off, I really appreciate you guys coming on, watching the show. It's definitely great to officially be back in business with the Nick Files. Certainly a very good start for not only season 2, but also for the Halloween season. I'll be back on here tomorrow night, obviously with Supernatural Talk. We're going to have an open mic night, I believe. And also I was told that I think we're probably going to be doing something Halloween related for that too. So anyways, I'm going to get off here. Thank you all so much. And even though I'll see probably some of you guys tomorrow, I'm going to still say it anyway. Happy Halloween. All right, everyone. Have a great night. I'll see some of you guys tomorrow, and we'll pick this up next week. So you guys all take care. Like I said, I'll see some of you guys tomorrow night, but if you want to wait for but for those that if you want to wait for the next show, I'll see some of you guys next week. Take care. Happy Halloween.